Okay, welcome to Take Two, and this is Creepy Creatures and Myths, a show within a show in the critical wage theory. And today we're going to be talking not about a creepy creature, but a myth. Today we're talking about a number, a statistical spike, or at least what looks like one. The number is 27. The 27 Club is both an urban legend and a cultural shorthand for a tragic pattern, the idea that famous musicians are unusually likely to die at the age of 27. Now, interestingly enough, I have not noticed this mythic number tied to the demise of people known primarily as actors, writers, or visual artists, for example. So, if you've heard the myth expanded into any of those other creative realms, feel free to let me know about those circumstances. What did you hear? Who was it? I'm interested in that for the sake of variety. Anyway, the main question, as far as the myth goes, is pretty obvious. Is the myth about tragic musicians being uniquely likely to die at 27 true or accurate? Or is it just another myth we tell ourselves to make sense of loss? So, you know how sometimes things are. If something is called a myth, that doesn't mean there's never any truth to it, right? It might have a little bit of a truthy aftertaste to it, even though, yes, we might admit that it seems like BS or whatever. Maybe it's not statistically verified to be an absolute truth, but it seems eerily accurate nonetheless. And I think that the 27 Club, it sort of fits into that category because there definitely are some examples of it. But do they withhold scrutiny? So, where the legend begins, the myth really caught fire in the late 1960s and early 1970s after a string of high profile deaths. Brian Jones, founder of the Rolling Stones, he drowned in 1969. Jimi Hendrix, called by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame arguably the greatest instrumentalist in the history of rock music, he died of asphyxiation in 1970. We also had Janis Joplin, who died shortly after that from a heroin overdose. Then in 1971, Jim Morrison of The Doors died of heart failure in Paris. His band took its name from a William Blake quote. There are things that are known and things that are unknown in between our doors. So he entered the door of the afterlife at the year of 1971 to make it a little bit cornier, tied it in thematically. And that's four cultural icons all gone within 2 years, all at the age of 27. And later the pattern seemed to repeat, only with some different faces and names. Kurt Cobain in 1994, Amy Winehouse in 2011, each hugely influential, at least for the amount of time that they were here on Earth, each gone too soon, each only 27. Suddenly, 27 wasn't just a number, it felt like a curse, and some musicians that people really celebrated and they seemed iconic, they suddenly were gone. And it really seems like a lot of interesting music was just forever dashed to the rocks, you know? It was forever to not be heard. So, part of the interesting thing about this myth is that question about the tragic loss of music. What would these musicians have gone on to create if they hadn't died at the age of 27? So that's another dynamic of this myth that's pretty fascinating too. It's it's really a way of kind of highlighting how all of these creative talents had their abilities just totally stripped away, and we can no longer really understand the uh, the nature of death if we're not really attuned to it fully. And it's that's part of the mystery here too, is the number of the number 27. Does it tie into death itself somehow? you know it's like a weird it's almost like a conspiracy theory or something like that, really, if you think about it. Like the mystery of life and death is in this case tied to a number. And if you really think about it like that, and you take this stuff seriously, I think your mind could just collapse, or your brain could explode, or whatever you want to. Circuits could get fried. And that's why sometimes you need to take a step back and just realize that, oh, these people just died at that age as a coincidence, probably. So the media coined the label the 27 Club. Fans repeated it and mourned with it and passed it down like folklore. For some, it almost felt like destiny, an invisible countdown clock attached to stardom. And like I said, it's also an element of mystery that makes these stars more fascinating. It's a way to make them larger than they were too. More tied into the mysteries of the universe. And when researchers actually study the data, however, they find something surprising. There isn't a statistical spike in deaths at 27 compared to other ages. You have people dying at different ages. This is just one where it seems like a unique number of people died. But dying at 27 doesn't make someone more likely to be famous or anything like that. And it's also true that um, if you are famous and dying at 27, it makes someone more legendary, because then they can be added to the roster of the 27 Club. So that's really a large part of what's going on here. It's coincidence mixed with confirmation bias. We notice the 27s and we forget the 25s, the 29s, or 32s. Sometimes a person will die who actually was quite famous, but the news media will barely even pay any attention to them. It could be somebody who at their time was sort of a superstar, but it's just barely a blip on the radar, so to speak. And, it all depends on the cultural lens. It really does have a cultural angle. At 27, you're old enough to have achieved fame, but young enough to still be reckless. Drugs, alcohol, burnout, destructive habits, they can all catch up pretty fast, and in some cases, they might wipe somebody out. And there's a psychological explanation. Humans are wired to look for patterns. When tragedy strikes, we want an explanation. Maybe a myth, a curse, a club, just something like that. Maybe a conspiracy theory, if you will. Any number of things that make the topic more interesting and more compelling. And for fans, it becomes a way to process grief as well. When Kurt Cobain died, his mother supposedly was quoted as saying, "Now he is gone and joined that stupid club. I told him not to join that stupid club." Now, I don't know if she actually said that. I didn't even see a valid source, but that's part of the legend, and that's really how these things grow. It's sort of like any other urban legend. It's got some variations, and in this case, maybe Kurt Cobain's mother actually did say that. I'm curious if you know the original source. I admittedly didn't research that quote as well as I could have, so if you can point me in the right direction, go right on ahead. And her words are now part of the legend, or her alleged words. So, what does the club represent really? Well, I got into that a little bit, but it has grown beyond superstition, the 27 Club. It's become a symbol, shorthand for talent lost too soon, for the destructive pressures of fame, and for society's obsession with doomed youth. There's a little bit of that get off my lawn, you damn kids element here too. Like these uh these kids are all troublemakers, these young adults, um, these people who are on the verge of becoming middle aged. They're all burnt out. They have nothing, nothing to live for anymore. They've sort of outlived their greatness or something like that. That's something you also get into when it comes to these stories. And in some cases, there might even be some truth to that. Now, this is a controversial point, but I've said in the past about Jimi Hendrix that by the time he expired, or however you want to, maybe that's not the best way to phrase it, but by the time he became deceased, he was known to be sort of, kind of phoning it in a way. He was not happy with the trajectory of his music career, and it kind of showed in some of his performances. You can tell that he was not feeling challenged. So at the time, he was actually trying to establish more of a jazz aspect to his music. He was trying to branch out and take things in a different direction. I think the pressures of being a rock star and the whole image. I think he was growing tired of that. And like, if I remember correctly, there's a live album, a live recording where he talks about like peace, love, and all that other bullshit. I think he says something like that. So he was just getting jaded at a certain point, and you could tell that his playing was a little bit sloppier, and it wasn't necessarily the drugs. I think he was feeling a little bit uninspired, and even if you're a great musician, it's still probably going to be apparent, at least to more discerning listeners. And yes, I would say that I can be a discerning listener. And the same thing I've heard about Kurt Cobain too. He was apparently considering doing more acoustic stuff, and perhaps even more like folksy and country stuff, which is kind of evidenced by what happened at the Unplugged show. He did the Lead Belly cover, which is obviously a classic cover. And if you don't think so, well, I question your taste in music, because frankly, that whole Unplugged performance by Kurt Cobain, I thought it was pretty amazing. I mean, even the worst song from that performance, I'm trying to think of it, might be that song Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam. Even that song is still great in my opinion. But that whole show, part of what makes it sort of iconic is that it really did seem like a transition phase for Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. And of course, there's speculation that he was on the verge of firing Dave Grohl and things like that. Now, I don't know to what extent that's true, but you'll you'll see plenty of people saying that online, and basically that might feed into the stories about his early demise, and it kind of makes the number aspect of it a little bit less relevant, though. Like the more you actually look behind the scenes. And of course, there's just an element that sometimes, these people were, they weren't necessarily doomed, but they they kind of were at the same time. Just the way that people, in your own life, some of them, they end up making the wrong choice at the wrong time, and you could see it as fate, or you could just see it as something that happened. It really depends on your point of view. It's not necessarily part of some mystical magical pattern, right? Sometimes people just, they have accidents. Even like, I know somebody who died because he fell down the stairs. He was drunk. I mean, that doesn't make him a tragic figure necessarily, or just, you know somebody who fell down the stairs by accident. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's one of those things. Like, what exactly is tragedy? What is fate? What is a grand design? Or is this just a bunch of random things that happen? It's really one of those interesting questions, and that's part of the myth as well, I suppose. It all forces us to ask hard questions. Why does fame so often come with self destruction? Why are artists pushed until it seems impossible for them to endure the pain? And why are we as an audience so captivated by the myth of the tragic young genius? And it's somber as a topic, but also fascinating, and maybe even helpful in some ways, because it gives food for thought. And maybe maybe it can inspire some people to not go down a similar path in some cases. In the end, the 27 Club isn't a curse, it's an urban myth, but it carries weight because it gives shape to something people struggle with: the shock of brilliance extinguished way too early. So it's not about numbers, it's about loss, and about the haunting question of what more these artists might have given the world if only they had reached the age of 28.